ahead and get started. If you all wouldn't mind joining me after the manner of friends with a moment of shared silence. Thank you so much and welcome. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Anna Wyeth, and I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement here at Sidwell Friends. We're so grateful to have you here tonight with us for this Conversation with Friends event. Before we get started, I just have a couple of quick housekeeping items. I want to encourage everybody to keep your video on if you feel comfortable doing so. It really helps us in these virtual events feel the full participation of the room. I also want to encourage you, excuse me, to change your Zoom name to include your full name and add your class year or your connection to the school. And you can do that by hovering over your own name in the participant list. And there's a little more button. You can click that and see rename as an option. You can think of this like your virtual name tag so everybody can see who else is here tonight. We'll ask everybody to keep themselves on mute just to minimize disruptions, and we'll save asking questions for the dedicated Q&A portion at the end of the event. But please feel free as we are going through this conversation tonight. If you have questions, please send them to me, Anna Wyeth, in the chat. And when we get to the Q&A, we'll be happy to ask your question when it's time. So finally, the real reason that we are all here tonight, I'm very excited to introduce our speakers. Rabbi Toba Spitzer, class of 1980, has served the Congregation Dorshei Tzedek since she was ordained in 1997 at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Rabbi Spitzer is a popular teacher of courses on Judaism and economic justice, Reconstructionist Judaism, new approaches to thinking about God, and the practice of integrating Jewish spiritual and ethical teachings into daily life. She served as the president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association from 2007 to 2009 and was the first LGBTQ rabbi to head a national rabbinic organization. She received the honor of being included in Newsweek's top 50 rabbis in America in 2008 and the 2008 Forward 50 list, as well as the 2010 Forward list of 50 female rabbis who are making a difference. And she's the immediate past president of the Massachusetts Board of Rabbis. Toba has been involved for many years in American Jewish efforts to help foster a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as work in the US for economic and social justice. She has served on the board of TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, and was a founding member of the advisory board of J Street. She has a special interest in Jewish approaches to economic justice and the mindful use of money in daily life. Her writings on process theology, Judaism and social justice, and the explorations of biblical texts have been published in the Reconstructionist Journal and the anthology Torah Queries, weekly commentaries on the Hebrew Bible. And while a student at RRC, she organized a rabbinic delegation to Haiti to serve as human rights witnesses during the military junta. That trip and the resulting Haitian Jewish Seder are described in her article Of Haiti and Horseradish in The Narrow Bridge, Jewish Views on Multiculturalism. Toba is a devoted and relatively patient Red Sox fan and also has a life goal of bowling in all 50 states, and she has 32 so far on her list. Leading tonight's conversation with Toba is classmate Arshad Mohammed, who is a reporter for Reuters covering American foreign policy. He joined Reuters in 1988 and has worked as a correspondent in New York, Paris, Algiers, and Washington, covering the White House and the State Department, and is now a DC-based diplomatic correspondent. During the pandemic, he has worked mostly from his living room overlooking 37th Street, just 4 blocks away from the Sidwell Friends campus. So with that, Arshad, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you all for being here. It's really a delight to see so many classmates and old friends joining us. And I'm particularly pleased that Toba's mother, Nessa Spitzer, is here. She is in some measure responsible for this super interesting book, for having brought forth Toba into the world to eventually write it. And it's really deeply pleasing to have some members of our parents' generation still with us. Let me say one other thing. There's something to me deeply gratifying about our society, imperfect as it is, that a rabbi and a Muslim who met as 12-year-olds almost half a century ago in Sidwell's Team 2 in middle school should be talking about kind of conceptions of God. I'm delighted that Sidwell provides a forum for this. Toba, I wanted to start by describing my earliest image of God, which I had in first or second grade, and it was of a European nobleman who was hugely tall, wore a red frock coat, had a frilly cravat shirt, had a sword at his side. Basically, my image was of a huge imperial colonial kind of white guy, which is an odd image for, a 6-year-old Muslim to come up with. I would love it if you would introduce kind of the thesis of God is Here, Reimagining the Divine, and the kind of alternatives to that stereotypical image that one might have of a deity.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you, Anna. Thanks, everyone. I have now bowled in 34 states, just had to update that. Let's get the important things out of the way. Yeah, so let me, before I read a little bit, I want to share, this book has been a journey. It's been 10 years writing it. And I'm going to come back to your image, Arshad, when I sort of describe this. As a rabbi and as a Reconstructionist rabbi, which for people who don't know is sort of the newest branch of Judaism, it emerged in the 1940s and 50s in America. And the founder, Mordecai Kaplan, was very adamant that sort of a supernatural big person idea of God wasn't going to work for most modern American Jews. And he started playing, this is in the 1920s, he started playing with God as process, as power. So for a long time, I thought my task was to come up with the image of God that would work for people who were my congregants, for the most part, highly educated, fairly secular, but spiritual Jewish people. That was sort of who I was. And I got into process theology for a while. We can talk about that in another phone call, another Zoom call. But sort of what would be the way to talk about the divine that would work for modern, maybe skeptical people. And then it was around 12 years ago, I think, I stumbled on a book called I as an Other, The Secret Life of Metaphor and How It Shapes How We See the World, something like that, by the author James Geary. And in this book, it's not about God, it's about metaphor and cognitive linguistics. I was familiar a little bit with the work of George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, who wrote about framing, and especially in the realm of politics. But Geary made this, in the book, sort of summarizes research in the field of cognitive linguistics, which makes the basic argument, a very simple argument, that as human beings, we apprehend the world through metaphor. And much of that apprehension is unconscious. We don't realize that we're apprehending the world through metaphor, but that we can't either talk about or even fully experience big areas of our lives like love or time or affection or arguments or all kinds of parts of our experience without metaphor. And then he did something in the book that made me go, aha, and brought me back to the God piece. And then I want to come back to your story, Arshad, which I love that you shared that. So in the book, Geary he uses the analogy of volcanoes, and he says there's active volcanoes and an active metaphor. He says is a metaphor that when you read it, it's a metaphor, and you have to unpack it. You have to think about it. The example I gave in the book is Mary Oliver in one of her poems talks about the dark hug of time. And we all know that time can't really hug anybody. So that's an active metaphor. Then there's dormant metaphors, dormant volcanoes. And a dormant metaphor is a metaphor that's basically a cliche. Like we know it's a metaphor, but we don't really think twice about it. An example he gives is, I'm up a creek without a paddle. So you know that when I say that, you know what I mean, even though you know I'm not really in a boat or in a creek. And finally, he talks about extinct metaphors. And an extinct metaphor is a metaphor that we use all the time, and we have no idea that we're inhabiting a metaphor when we use it. And these are foundational, certainly in our culture, probably across cultures. So one example he gives is when we say, I see what you mean. This is a metaphor. The metaphor is knowing is seeing. And it comes from early infant experience that if I don't see you, you don't exist. So knowing is seeing. Another very basic metaphor is affection is warmth. And it comes from being held as a baby against someone's body. And so physical warmth and emotional safety or connection get connected. So we say things like, she's a very warm person. And so this was Lakoff and Johnson's theory. It later got bolstered by neuroscience, which could see the connections being made. But for me, what happened in that moment was I read about extinct metaphors, and I was like, aha, God is an extinct metaphor. Meaning when most people in the West, for certain, this is not true of every culture, but in the West, and certainly in the Abrahamic religions, when we're talking about God, we are inhabiting a metaphor of God as a big person. Now, sometimes people are very detailed in that image, and that's what you had, Arshad. I don't know where. Maybe you had seen a big painting or something, and that had sort of. But even if we said we don't believe in it, and even if maybe our person is not exactly as detailed as your image, just the way we talk about God sees, God knows, God loves, God judges. All those verbs assume that God is a human being. And the thing about extinct metaphors is we don't know we're using them, but we're in them anyway. And so I realized, wow, for the most fervent disbelievers, as well as for most believers, when we argue about God, we're not arguing about God, we're arguing about a metaphor. And so this set me off thinking, well, if that's the case, I know that our tradition, my Jewish tradition, has other metaphors. What would it be like to explore other specifically non-human metaphors for the divine? And what I realized was we have so many metaphors. And there's nothing wrong with human metaphors. But the thing about a metaphor is it's not a definition. It's a way of accessing an experience. I'm just going to screen share very briefly, and then I'll turn to the book. I'm not, maybe someone on this Zoom is a cognitive linguist. I'm not, but this is my understanding of how it works. So metaphor, these are what are called, Lakoff and Johnson call conceptual metaphors. And on the target domain, on the right side of the screen, are the parts of human experience that we need metaphor to access, that we can't actually describe or understand, literally. We need metaphors to get to it. And then on the left side, the source domain are physical embodied experiences we have that are the basis for the metaphor. These are metaphors that we function in all the time without knowing it. I started with anger because these are two of my favorites. Anger is a hot liquid in a container, and anger is a horse. Now that might sound ridiculous, but if you look at our language below here, you'll see that, again, we use this all the time. So anger is a hot liquid in a container. They are boiling mad. She blew her top. I need to blow off some steam. Anger is a horse. We talk about unbridled anger. We say he couldn't rein in his temper. We say, here are some ways you can harness your anger. So the reason I wanted to show you this is to say that metaphor is always based in embodied experience. So even though the target domain, the part of human experience we're getting at is abstract, is conceptual, we get at it through our embodied experience. And what's also important that Lakoff and Johnson argue is that these metaphors aren't just how we speak, they structure our experience. And I really like to use time as an example. There are different metaphors for time. In our culture, in Western industrialized culture, one of the, maybe the major metaphor for time that we inhabit is money. Time is money, or time is a limited resource. And here's some linguistic examples. You're wasting my time. This gadget will save you hours. How do you spend your time these days? We need to budget our time. What's important about the time one is that people before the Industrial Revolution didn't experience time this way. And there are parts of the world and places that people still don't. But when we started getting paid by the hour, by the day, we had this new understanding of time. So this is important about the God stuff, and then I'll come to God. Metaphors are not definitions. They are ways that we experience things. And a new metaphor has the ability to actually change our experience. So when you're sitting in a doctor's office waiting for an appointment and it's going and you've been in there for an hour, you feel like you're wasting, or I do. I feel like I'm wasting my time. This is not just a linguistic thing, right? I'm wasting my time. But of course I'm not. How can you waste time? That's ridiculous. It's not, this is not true. It's not the essence of time that it can be wasted. It's just how, this metaphor has structured my experience. So in turning to the realm of the divine, what I realized was I wanted to shift the conversation from do I believe or do I not believe to an assumption that I have, which I think is true, that all human beings in all places at all times have had collectively and individually experiences of what we call the divine or the sacred. And the experiences are similar. The concepts have radically been different. And that we have ways into that experience that don't need necessarily the metaphor of God as a big person. Again, that's not a bad metaphor. It might be problematic in some ways. I think, Arshad, you lifted up that maybe for a little, brown Muslim boy, a big white colonial God might not be the most healthy way to, to experience the divine, but I don't know. That's for you to decide. But we need more. We need a rich palette. We could never talk about love, experience love with just one metaphor. We don't just want to talk about time as a limited resource. We want to experience time as endless and, as a flow that's endless in both directions. So this is where I talk about this in the book. Many years ago, I worked in an ice cream store in Cambridge, Massachusetts. On any given day, we had over 20 flavors of ice cream available, and we were always experimenting with new ones. One day, a father and his young son came into the store. The little boy, not yet able to read, asked his dad, "What flavors are there?" The father looked up at our wonderful list of flavors of the day, and he answered, "There's chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry." While I sympathized with the dad trying to not overwhelm his child with too many choices, I felt so sad for that little boy. Here was a diverse world of marvelous ice cream flavors hidden from him only because he couldn't read. It's how I feel about most people's experience of God metaphors. If our only flavor choices are God the distant ruler, or God is an all-powerful and perfect being that we can't really understand, I'd probably walk out of the store. But the happy reality is that our religious traditions offer the equivalent of Baskin-Robbins' 31 flavors when it comes to metaphors for God. And nothing is stopping us from discovering new metaphors that are relevant, powerful, and meaningful to our lives today. So the rest of the book, the first two chapters, I sort of lay out what I've just sort of told you on one foot here. And then the rest of the book is different metaphors, mostly from the Hebrew Bible, which is also part of the Christian Bible. One from rabbinic tradition and one chapter that has modern metaphors. And most of them are from nature, water, fire, cloud, sound, or voice. And I sort of go into both how the metaphor manifests in Jewish tradition and in other traditions. And then I give practices at the end of each chapter because for two reasons. One, we need to bring these metaphors alive. Extinct metaphors are in our brains. They're very hard to uproot. So if we're going to really get other metaphors in there, we need to practice them and make them real. And the other reason is that my contention and assumption is that, how we relate to the divine should shape our lives in some way for the good, for ourselves, wholesome for ourselves and for the world around us. And the practices are intended for that purpose. So that's sort of the on one foot overview of what the book's trying to do.
So, Toba, one of the metaphors that you explore that I loved is the metaphor of God as water. And I thought a fair amount about this. And if you'd like to read a section, please do, perhaps about Gina or about your dad. But I thought about how when my dad died 5 years ago now, I thought of, grief so often comes in waves. Sometimes you feel that you're drowning from it. Sometimes the water is still. And one thing that I found and that surprised me was that grief also led to kind of a wellspring of deep compassion. One of my favorite authors who lost his mother as an infant talks about how that loss created a hole in his world which in one of its manifestations is a fountain. So again, all those water terms, languages. And the thing I found particularly beautiful that I'd love for you to share a little more about is, if you think, rather than thinking of God as a specific kind of corporeal being, if you think of God as water, you are suddenly thinking about a flow, of tapping into a flow, of navigating an ocean or rapids or whatever it happens to be.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing a little bit about your experience when your dad passed. Yeah, I was sort of surprised when I knew that there were water images, in the Hebrew Bible, but I was really surprised when I started looking into it, just how many, like what I call water names of the divine there were. And it certainly makes sense. The Hebrew Bible was written in the Near East, in a very dry part of the world where water was not taken for granted in any way. And I start the chapter where I think you began there, because I started the chapter on water about my dad and his first heart attack before he died when he was 40, and how water activities became sort of his spiritual practice. I am going to share a little bit from the book, and I want to share this particular section because I think it shows how when we shift metaphors, we shift like the questions we ask. So the part I'm going to share is about when my spouse Gina was in the final months of her life. She died of breast cancer 6 years ago, and how water played into it. And I was really sitting with this metaphor and working on the book, during that year, and how and when something terrible happens to you, and some of the questions that I often hear as a rabbi, why is this happening to me? How could God do this to me? If God is good, why would this happen? Those questions didn't make sense once we shifted metaphor. So let me share this, and then we can talk about it. I found the metaphor of God as water to be enormously helpful during some of the most challenging months of my life. In the spring of 2014, my spouse, Gina, was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. After a year of experimental treatments, in which she was relatively symptom-free, in the fall of 2015, things took a turn for the worse, and she died the following March. Those months leading up to her death, during which she endured a nasty course of chemotherapy, were profoundly difficult. I needed every ounce of strength and compassion I could find to be a support to Gina, and to keep from being overwhelmed by sadness and despair. During this journey, I found myself drawn to a chant composed by my colleague and teacher, Rabbi Shefa Gold, a setting of a verse from the book of Isaiah. And this is the verse: "When you pass through the waters, I am with you. I won't let the rivers overwhelm you." Chanting these words, I realized the profound insight of this verse. As I struggled to understand where God was in the terrible reality I was facing, I realized that water is essential to life. Indeed, water is life. And yet sometimes it is also that which threatens me, overwhelms me, drowns me. God was at one and the same time the waters through which I was passing, and that which supported me as I made my way through an unbearable reality. Facing the prospect of the death of my beloved, I didn't rail against the unfairness of an inscrutable God who had brought suffering into my life. Instead, in the slow motion heartbreak of that terrible year, I did my best to sit with the reality that ultimately faces each and every one of us. I remembered my father's instruction to lean into, not away from, the turbulence when navigating a kayak through the rapids. I understood that the waves can be overwhelming and terrifying, and yet within them is the godly presence that sustains and supports me, even in the most difficult moments. I gave myself over to overwhelming waters, allowing myself to feel the profound sorrow within them, even as I sought the reassurance of God's presence accompanying me as I made my way down the river. And I think what I also found, Arshad, was that in exploring these different metaphors, the reality is that all of these sort of elemental forces are both, can be both pleasant and unpleasant, right? Water, we can't live without it. It's nourishing, it's sustaining, fount of life, all the things we talked about. And there's tsunamis, and there's, and that's just, but we don't get angry at a tsunami. My example of that, it's like the question became not like, why is this happening to me, but how do I navigate this? That's a really useful question. Why is this happening to me is a completely useless question. Like, I don't know, it's just happening. Like, why not me? But how do I navigate this? Then that's a question I can do something with. And that's how shifting the metaphor to water in that moment, and to say, where is God in this? Where, what does support me as I make my way through the troubled waters? And with the other metaphors as well, fire, we need it to warm ourselves. Your fingers get too close, you get burned. With each of the metaphors, it allows us, I think, to explore both the difficulty as well as the beauty of life in a way that some of the human metaphors just don't allow for.
So could you talk a little bit more about the one of the very nice oppositions you have in the book, which is talking about, the conception of God that many people have as a coercive power who lays down laws and rules and edicts that are to be followed or not followed, that there is punishment or reward that attaches to compliance or non-compliance. And one of the things I really liked about the notion of God as water was what you described as persuasive power, that the way water operates, it can drown you, but it can nudge you, it can lift you, it can direct you, it can carry you. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. Yeah. So this comes from process theology. The process theologians distinguish between coercive power, which is power over, which is usually the kind of power associated with the divine, for better or for worse, i.e., I can make you do what I want you to do, what I want to do, versus persuasive power, which is really more the power we encounter. Persuasive power is the power that parents use, or teachers, or good leaders. They're not making us do it. They might try to, but ultimately they're trying to nudge us in the right direction. So when I was thinking about the metaphors, for a Jewish theology, there must be obligation. Like Jews, in the Christian theologies I was exploring, there was sort of a contentment with God as love, and that's beautiful, and it's in Judaism as well. But we have mitzvahs, we have things we're supposed to do, and which metaphor was going to work to sort of convey a sense of obligation. And another scholar, had written about how most of, in the Hebrew Bible, in the prophets, justice is often conceptualized as water. So then I started playing with that metaphor. So what is it? So then the question becomes not do I obey or disobey, but what is the godly flow of justice in the world? And how do I align myself with that flow? And again, that's a very different question. So we sort of step out of the coercive model of obey or disobey and into, I don't really want to be swimming upstream against the godly flow of the universe. So A, how do I discern what the flow is? And B, how do I align my actions with it? And yeah, water's powerful, right? And sometimes it's a slow drip, drip, drip over eons that gives us a canyon, and sometimes it's a tsunami. There's too much in that chapter to go into all the details, but I think some of the chapters in the Bible, in the Torah, especially the first 5 books of the Bible, that are read as God as commander, I think actually are using a water metaphor of flow, and they've been misunderstood, I think, by moderns. Is my reading of that.
Something I wanted to note is that a metaphor of water abounds in the Quran. I mean, there are multiple references to water, and at times it is. I was actually looking up some of these when I was getting ready for this today, and there are some which associated. The one I was particularly thinking of wasn't just social justice, but it was truthfulness and honesty, and the notion that water can sort of help. It can generate a certain amount of dross that goes away, but the essential stuff, the truth, remains. Would you tell the story of your unknown aspiration to be a physicist, which I loved, because neither of us was particularly good at math or science in school.
Yeah. So this Arshad, if you have the book, it's page 247. So this is from the end of the book. I decided I wanted to have one chapter that had some modern metaphors. So I chose GPS, which I call godly positioning system, and electricity. The notion of God as electricity is not original to me, but I wanted to explore it. So this is the little piece that Arshad is referencing. A few years into my rabbinate, I was on a retreat with about 30 other rabbis from across the Jewish denominations. On the opening night, we did a get to know you exercise in which we had a series of 3-minute conversations with one another, each with a different prompt. As I moved around the circle of colleagues, I prepared to answer the question, if you hadn't become a rabbi and money or ability or prerequisite knowledge were not an issue, what would you have been? I was pretty sure I was going to say I'd have been a community organizer. I had worked in a variety of progressive organizations before going to rabbinical school, and I identified as a social justice activist. So imagine my surprise when it was my turn to answer the question, and what came out of my mouth was, I would have been a physicist. The reason I found this completely surprising is that I am terrible at math and never got anywhere near a physics class in my high school or college years. There is no one less likely to have become a physicist than I. But after I gave my answer, I realized that I do share something with those who are blessed to do physics, a sense of wonder at the universe, and a deep desire to understand how things work. As a rabbi, I get to engage in big questions, and I seek to discern some kind of meaningful order in what often feels like a disordered, chaotic world. I want to know what makes us tick, and what the larger context is for human existence. And while I can't really fathom what physicists do, I wonder if some of the same desires and curiosities are at play. When I read the Hebrew Bible, I imagine that its authors were sort of like me, and sort of like modern physicists, seeking answers to how the cosmos works and what our place in it is. Their experience of the divine was part of that exploration, was in fact inseparable from it. Science offers metaphors that help me understand some of the more challenging aspects of the biblical portrayal of God. So I don't think I'll go on here, but I go on to talk about electricity. Actually, let me jump ahead to the electricity part on 252. When I was poking around on the internet with the question, what is electricity? I found this intriguing answer. Electricity is all around us, powering technology like our cell phones, computers, lights, soldering irons, and air conditioners. It's tough to escape it in our modern world. Even when you try to escape electricity, it's still at work throughout nature, from the lightning in a thunderstorm to the synapses inside our body. But what exactly is electricity? This is a very complicated question. And as you dig deeper and ask more questions, there really is not a definitive answer, only abstract representations of how electricity interacts with our surroundings, end quote. I love this reticence to give a definitive answer to my question, an acknowledgement that in the realm of science, as well as in the realm of religion, there remain some questions that resist the limits of human explanation. One could easily change the question to what is God and rework the answer to say, this is a very complicated question. And as you dig deeper and ask more questions, there really is not a definitive answer, only abstract representations of how God interacts with our surroundings. But we do know some things about electricity. At its root, it is the movement of electrons, and electrons are among the fundamental building blocks of the universe. To think about the divine as electricity is to affirm the godly energy that moves within us and within all of creation. God as electricity also invites us to think about how we can connect in productive and energizing ways to the kinetic divine flow. And then I go on with some ideas about how to do that. So.
But before we turn it over to the broader sort of Q&A, one of the things that you and I have talked about over the last day or so that I thought was super interesting is, as I recall, you said you're trying to get away from the notion of belief or non-belief. Do you believe or not believe? And to get more into the realm of experience. And for those who have been consumed by the question of belief or non-belief, so many people go through phases of belief or agnosticism or atheism, or eventually coming to belief or being conscious of a sort of a spiritual impulse, even if they don't put a name to it. I wonder if you could, how is it that the kinds of mindfulness practices that you describe, or the way of looking at the world that you suggest, that gets us out of the frame of believer, non-believer, and more into the frame of experiencing the world, can lead to a deeper sense of spirituality. I don't say faith, I don't say religion. I'm deliberately using the word spirituality.
Thank you. No, that really is, I think, the crux of why I wrote this book. And I think there was a Pew study that came out on religion in the American society recently, and ever increasing numbers of Americans are saying they're not religious, but they still say they're spiritual. And it's an interesting. I personally have never experienced that divide in my life, but for a lot of people, that's a really real divide. And religion represents, right, authority or dogma or things they can't believe in, and spirituality, refers to their heart and soul. Yeah, I want to really just change the conversation, to there's a realm of human experience that I'm calling the divine or the sacred. You don't have to ever use the word God if that word doesn't work for you. For some people, that word is comfortable. To me, it's as big a realm of human experience as love, as creativity. It's foundational, I think, to who we are, and our traditions have a lot of wisdom, and my ancestors, the folks who wrote the Bible and the people who came after them in the rabbinic tradition, use mythological language, use metaphoric language to try to get at that experience. And I think too often the baby is thrown out with the bathwater. It's like, well, I don't believe in God, and therefore all these, and there's sort of a hyper literal reading of the Bible, and everything's thrown out. So we lose, I think, very amazing wisdom that not just in the Jewish tradition or Christian, it's in every tradition. And some indigenous religions never lost this. I think we lost it in Judaism, maybe when the Jews were disconnected from their home, from that land where this grew. Maybe when they experienced empire and God became a distant, ruler. I don't know exactly when it happened, but in the earliest parts of the Hebrew Bible, there's this very foundational connection to rock, to fire, to water, to the land. And that shaped how those folks wrote about God and the sacred. And I want to access that. I don't want to have an argument about existence. I want to say, how do I get me some of that? How do I get closer to that experience of connection, to feeling connected to the earth, to myself, to other human beings? And because those of us in religious traditions that use the word God, either in English or in other languages, because God is such an obstacle for so many people, I wanted it to be a book about God, and to say whether you use that particular word or not, there are ways into this experience, and there's practices that'll be useful. And there's so many names. I mean, one thing I include in the book is just a lot of different names of the divine, many from some from the natural world. A very common rabbinic name for God was makom, place. Like, what happens when we call God place? What does that do? It just changes everything. So that really is the crux of the book. And that's why I do have the practices, because I feel like that's just not, I'm remembering Phil Disk with Anne Yondorf my senior year, when we were reading all these like medieval Christian philosophers, right, who thought like God could be reduced to sort of a logic theorem, like you could sort of logic your way to God, and that doesn't make any sense to me. Like it's not a useful conversation. I prefer to like help people actually have an experience that's powerful and meaningful. And the final thing I'll say on that, and then I think we should open up to questions if folks have them, is I think the metaphors matter. I think, if our only metaphor for the divine is God as an imperial ruler, and the only model of godly power we have is tyranny, then we're going to think tyrannical power is godly. I think that's unhealthy. So by sort of multiplying the kinds of metaphors we have, and being able to have other ways to talk about power, to talk about other aspects of our experience, I think it's healthy for us. It's healthy for the planet. It's healthy for our society. So I actually think it matters what metaphors we use. And that conversation, which metaphors we use and what they imply, to me is so much more important than debating whether or not God exists, which really, as I said before, was just really a debate about a metaphor, because it's always about God as a big person that controls everything. That's what that debate is about, as far as I can tell. So anyway, that's a little taste of the book, but I'd love to hear folks' questions or reactions.
Thank you. Well, we have a couple of questions that have come in, which I'm happy to offer. And just a reminder, folks, please feel free to send questions in the chat, or if you'd like to ask your question yourself, just let me know in the chat that you're interested in asking a question, and we'll be happy to call on you. We did just get one that came through the chat. This is from Denise Terry, who's a parent and a former faculty member, who asked, I would love to hear an example of a practice that Toba presents in the book.
Sure, there's many kinds. some of the practices are to connect, to sort of bring alive some of the images in the either in liturgy or in the Bible. So, for example, in the water chapter, I offer, there's some chants, just the repetition of a sacred phrase that my colleague Rabbi Sheffa Gold has done. Some of the practices are more meditation practices. I have, I think it's in the water chapter. There's one about alignment, and it's a practice that is more of a values clarification practice. Let me just see if it's in there. I can't remember which one's which. Yes. So I have a practice about, values clarification, writing down what you value, and then for 1 week, writing down how you spend your time and your money, and then seeing if how you spend your time and your money, matches up with your values. That's about alignment, this notion of flow. So that's one example. Sometimes I just encourage people, like in the chapter on fire, I try to encourage people to connect to fire. It's very powerful to do a candle meditation before bed. So there's really a bunch. They're not all Jewish practices. Some are, I also have a 25-year mindfulness practice from the Buddhist tradition. So some comes from that. Every tradition that I know of has fire meditation. So, and again, some are text-based, some are, some come out of mindfulness practice. Some are writing practices. So I really just invite people to play and to try them out. And some are, and then a few things I suggest that are, you can't do on your own. Like one is like encouraging people to check out spiritual direction if you're interested in that. So it's really a variety, and knowing that, people relate to these kind of things in really different ways.
May I share one, Toba, that you didn't?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So this is in the water chapter, and I'm just going to read it. Water blessings. In Jewish practice, it is traditional to say a blessing both when we wash our hands before eating and when we drink water. Saying blessings is, in essence, a mindfulness practice, an opportunity to pause before a mundane act and to become fully present in the daily miracles with which we are blessed. I found that quite interesting because that's obviously a very common practice in Christianity to say grace before a meal. In Islam, people normally say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, which is one of the things I particularly love about Islam, that core phrase emphasizes mercy and compassion. And one of the things I've thought about, I have someone I know who has had a number of struggles, has sought to improve their lives by making sort of gratitude lists, which seems like, in some ways it seems like a silly thing, but I have found that it's actually quite a profound thing, because if you adopt a posture of gratitude rather than grievance, why have I not won 17 Pulitzer Prizes, and why am I not 6'5", and why don't I drive a Ferrari, but rather feel grateful for my Subaru Forester. Maybe you have kind of a different outlook. Anyway, that was one I certainly liked.
Yeah. Yes, and thank you. There's practices, gratitude practices I suggest, and a number of blessing practices. And for folks who are Jewish, I'm hoping it's a way maybe into Jewish practices that folks might not be aware of, but I try to make it accessible. And I do encourage people to go back to their own traditions. Like I suggest chanting, and I offer some Jewish chants, but chanting is a Sufi practice. It's a Native American practice. I don't know as much about Hinduism, but I know that each of these traditions have these practices. So yeah, it's not. So even though there's a lot of Jewish practice in here, I also suggest ones that, for folks to check out their own, backgrounds. And yeah, Jews, there's a lot of blessings in Judaism. So there are definitely a bunch of blessing practices in there. What else, Anna?
Well, Sharon Hinckley, who's class of 63, has a question. I'm going to go ahead and ask her to unmute and ask her question.
Fabulous.
So I don't know that mine is so much a question. I want to start by saying in 1963, if you had told me that I would become a yoga teacher, that I would be using a computer, much less teaching on one, I would have invited you to return to your home planet. And I feel very blessed to have gone to Sidwell Friends. I got sent to Sidwell Friends because I was a disruptive child. And I'm grateful that it was Frank Barger that lived across the street from my grandparents and not a Catholic priest. I can see that I might have had more challenges. But anyway, yeah, I love what you said about your gratitude practice and the water and so on and so forth. I also, it never occurred to me that I would be studying with a Sanskrit scholar. So my life has definitely gone in directions I could never have imagined. But one of the things that I have discovered, even in high school, some of the things that we think are metaphors are actually things that happened so long ago that we don't even think it's real. For instance, according to the National Geographic, the Red Sea parts every 1,000 years during a certain wind condition, whether Moses shows up with a bunch of angry Egyptians or not. But the one that to me was the most fascinating, I was reading the teachings of Sadhguru Shivaya Subramaniya Swami. You have to be clean and sober to say that. But anyway, one of the things that he taught was that the reason we're having so much difficulty on Earth right now is that we're so far from the great central sun. And I thought, well, that's a nice story. And, you know, I didn't pay much attention to it until I went to a program that Stanford had put on with the NASA head of the Voyager program. And she was telling us different things. And she said, and we're on our way back to the great central sun. And I'm like, wait a minute. Hello.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm gonna close you off so I can for other people.
I'm done.
Appreciate that. Yeah, no, thank you for sharing your experience. Yeah, and the only thing I would caution is I think when religion, is only acceptable if it says things that are factually true, I think it's problematic for religion. It's not that those things might not be true. I have no idea. Like, the stories in the Hebrew Bible it's too long ago for us to know. And where I appreciate the urge to want to ground it in, a kind of historical reality. To me, that's not actually, I think that for me, I'm talking personally, the Hebrew Bible is trying to get at truth, not facts, and truth is much bigger than facts. So I'm more interested in those deeper truths, which, as you've said really beautifully, every tradition has, and how do we get at that through mythical language, which the Bible uses, and it's a way, as moderns, we actually can't enter into mythical thinking. I think our brains don't work that way. It's very hard for us to get into that kind of way of relating to the world. But it's clear to me that the folks, having these very profound experiences of the divine, were closer to it than probably I can ever be. And I want to, and the question is, how do we get closer to those experiences? Any other questions?
We did have one. This is from Michael Heller, your wonderful classmate. And this
Michael
gets at a question that I think a number of people had. So Michael, I'll let you go ahead and ask your question.
Great. First of all, Toba, congratulations. Your book is physically a beautiful object and is beautifully written. So congratulations on that. I wanted to invite you to speak a little bit about relationship between Quaker metaphors of godliness and the images that you have in the book. And specifically, what I want to hear is to what extent or how your experience at Sidwell with Quakerism and Quaker meeting shapes some of your path as you move to write this book.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I saw someone else had sent that question, and I hadn't really thought about it that much, so I appreciate folks raising it. I think I was just lucky, and this came up a little bit in Arshad, as Arshad and I were preparing this. I never really struggled with God concepts as a kid, and I think I must have been just very lucky at being exposed to like a variety of them early enough that there wasn't a God I had to rebel against. And I think that came through my dad's connection to nature. I think from my mom's sort of questioning, and I think embodying a connection to the divine through community and through music. And I think it came through being part of a very progressive, sort of funky Jewish community growing up, and my guess is Sidwell did influence it. In the sense of, first of all, just offering silence. That was, I now have a pretty deep mindfulness practice, but that was my first experience of just sitting quietly and being, I don't remember explicit metaphors for the divine, but sort of being invited. And there wasn't a lot of religious language, but I certainly remember us being invited to feel something, godly in us. I certainly remember that. So I think it all was part of me having this really gift of experiencing the divine in different ways. I think having friends from many different traditions, Radhika's here or was going to be here, from, was Hindu, and I had Muslim friends. And I think just being exposed, I started in 7th grade fairly early to people, with really different religious backgrounds was helpful. So I can't, point a straight line from here to there. And, I wouldn't have known that I was becoming a rabbi in 7th or 8th grade or even high school. I probably would have been surprised if you had told me that. But I can't imagine that being exposed to a way of experiencing divinity that was not dogmatic, and that wasn't even based in text, it was really based in experience, was an important part of that. And I know when I discovered, going on silent retreats after rabbinical school, it did feel like coming home in a certain way. I really love the quiet. And I talk about meditation as one path. So I would imagine, but yeah, shout out to it was St. Martin's Press. Shout out. I had nothing to do with what this looks and feels like. This is so nice. It's just nice to have a book about God, like feel good. You can put it in your bag. You can like carry it. So I'm glad you like it, Michael.
We'll make sure that we put the link in the chat for where you can find the book. We had one other question, which came from another former faculty member, David Bogg, wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you think about prayer, given how you think about God.
Yeah, so it really depends on the prayer. In the electricity chapter, I go on to talk about saying blessings is like plugging in. In Jewish practice, when we say a blessing, we acknowledge the source. We first, it's a blessing for whatever we're doing, whether it's eating or going to the bathroom or putting on clothes, whatever the blessing is, but it always begins, blessed are you, the divine, our God. And so the metaphor I've thought about for a long time is that it's like, if God's the electricity, then the blessing is like plugging in, it's connecting me back to the source. So that's one way to think about prayer. I also think the different metaphors allow us to ask for things, appropriate to that metaphor. So the example I gave of the water chants when, in Gina's, in that final year of Gina's life, I was sort of seeking, guidance in navigation or to not be overwhelmed. Some of the verses about God as rock, there's a chapter about God as rock or about refuge and seeking refuge. And I feel like we have hints in the Bible of practices that our ancestors did. Like one of the Psalms says, sing to the rock. I imagine that they were actually singing to rocks. I mean, we take it right now as like sort of a metaphor, but I think that was probably a practice. When I was studying this with my congregants, when I was working on this, like I gave them all a rock and I just told them to carry it around for a week and just see what happens. So prayer can take very many different forms. The other thing I suggest for folks with the prayer practice is that there's a lot of different names for the divine, is to play with those as well. What happens when you're talking to, Makor Mayim Chaim, the fount of living waters, or to Tzur Levavi, the rock of my heart? What happens if you use that as a name instead of what other name, or the unfortunate Lord, which is really not even a translation of the ineffable name of the divine in the Hebrew Bible. I don't know exactly how this works for Christians because there is a person, Jesus, that prayer is directed to, so I can't speak to that, but I know that there's other metaphors in Christian tradition. So that would be an interesting, I think, path of study for Christians for this work. So that's another way I think that prayer can work in this. In Jewish tradition, most prayer is praise and gratitude. Very little prayer is, there's very little formal prayer that's asking for anything. So the praise and gratitude can take many forms. I think many of the metaphors can work for praise and gratitude.
Thank you. Arshad, I want to check and make sure we have one more hand up. I was going to say, we'll see if Arshad has any questions up his sleeve, but we have just time for a couple more. So Dan, who just raised his hand, I'm happy to offer an opportunity to ask a question.
Yes, I've enjoyed this. I'm another member of the class of 63. And just getting around to thinking about God and stuff like that again. And I've been sort of thinking about faith lately, and I always thought of faith as dogma and having trouble believing in things. But a minister talked to me and said, well, you have faith in your ability as an architect to create a beautiful building. And I thought about it, and there's a lot of sort of mystical power there. Why am I so confident in that? I'm wondering how you think of faith in these new ways of thinking about God.
Thank you. I actually write about faith. I just have to find this. Give me 1 second. I deal with faith in the chapter on the metaphor of becoming. It's the only metaphor that's a little more abstract. It's based on a name of the divine in the Hebrew Bible, Ehyeh. So the idea, and this brings me back to Alfred North Whitehead and process theology, which is God as potential. And I actually talk about uncertainty in this chapter. So let me find this part about faith. Sorry. Here we go. One winter at a retreat for Jewish clergy, I met Cantor Sue Knight Deutsch, who told a group of us an amazing story. Earlier that year, she found herself facing a life choice that terrified her. As she shared with me later, quote, "It felt like I was jumping off a cliff. So I decided to embody and face my fear by actually jumping off a cliff," end quote. She decided to go paragliding. I listened in awe as Sue described the instructor's words to her. Run toward the edge of the cliff, and when the ground disappears beneath your feet, keep running. Deeply fearful, she did as she was told. Stepping off the cliff into nothing, having faith in her instructor and the glider that held them both, she was aloft, getting a view of the world that she'd never had before. Cantor Sue's story is about facing our fears, but it's also about faith, not blind faith. Sue had done her research and found an experienced paragliding instructor who had never had an accident. But as she wrote to me later about this experience, quote, "The worst part of jumping was running toward the edge of the cliff. In that moment, when you hit the edge, have faith you will be lifted," end quote. Too often, people misconstrue faith with certainty, assuming that to have faith means to be confident in the outcome, to know exactly where things are going to end up. But as life has a way of teaching us, we rarely know where we're going to end up or how we're going to get there. Martin Luther King Jr. is reported to have once said, "Faith is the first step, even when you don't see the whole staircase." To take that first step, we have to trust the process, capital P, that's the metaphor, while relinquishing our need to control where it might ultimately take us. As the Buddhist teacher Sharon Salzberg notes, quote, "Any insistence that people or circumstances meet our exact expectations is not faith, but another effort at control, bound to end up in disappointment." Let me just read that again. Any insistence that people or circumstances meet our exact expectations is not faith, but another effort at control, bound to end in disappointment. If we embrace God as change, as becoming, then we have to be willing to relinquish our need to be in control. Things as they are now, in our own lives, in the world around us, are often not what we expected. Things as they are now will inevitably change in ways that we cannot predict. So faith becomes an embrace of uncertainty and a willingness to take the next step. That's what I would say, how I would think about faith.
That's good.
Good, thank you.
Well, Arshad, I want to give you one last chance to ask anything else that's lingering from our earlier conversation before we close out.
I just one thing. I have a sympathy for, and this is not me, but those who are entirely without a sense of belief or faith. And I know, Toba, you don't want to talk about sort of the Western philosophical tradition, but the Hobbesian view of religion as a pill, which if chewed upon with logic must be spat out, but if swallowed, And I wonder what in your practice as a rabbi, how you, and this may be indeed partly why you wrote the book, how you seek to help, guide, nurture people who are absent a sense of faith or absent consciousness of a sense of the divine. What do you tell them?
I mean, what I say is everyone has a spirit and everyone needs to feed their spirit. And I think the word faith, as a Jew, I don't relate to the word faith. Jews don't talk about themselves as people. I mean, when we're in interfaith circles, we become a communities of faith. I think most Jews I know would not say that they're people of faith. We're people of practice. So even the word faith, I find a very Christian word. So I don't, to me, the issue is not whether you have faith or not. The issue is, are you open to experience? Do you want to feed your soul and your spirit? And maybe this book will help you do that. Maybe not. There are many other ways. I think there's other ways to feed your spirit. We heard from a yoga teacher, yoga feeds people's spirits, meditation. For people who are allergic to God, that's what's a little different, I think, than what you're saying. For people who are allergic to God or God concepts, my hope is the book will allow folks to come back in and say, wow, maybe I can approach this differently. And for people who have no problem with God, who are comfortable saying I'm a person of faith, who go to services, my hope is the book will just expand the palette, just give you more colors to paint with. It's not just for non-believers, but for people who want to adamantly, I've known very few actual atheists. And to me, an actual atheist is someone who is comfortable living in a reality that the world is completely random chaos. I know very few people who are willing to do that. It takes a certain kind of courage. And I don't argue with those people. I don't want to argue with anybody. Most people aren't there. Most people would say agnostic. They would say they're uncomfortable with God language. They would say, I don't have faith, but they wouldn't say I'm totally fine. Just have just standing in the swirl of neurons and electrons and it's all random, complete and total randomness. But that's a hard place to, there's some people who manage it. I go for it, but most people I encounter are not those people. And if you're not, and if you're open to thinking about, spirit and feeding one's soul, then the question is how. And maybe I'll end with a Bob Dylan quote. That's a great song. You got to serve somebody. We're all serving something. The question is what? Are you serving money? Are you serving power? Are you serving fame? Are you serving humanity? Are you serving your ego? Like what are you serving? And to me, the thought of serving the divine and having my life in service to something beyond myself is powerful to me. But we can all ask, what am I serving? And whatever the answer is, that then we have to deal with that. So maybe that's the way to think about it. I have no idea if I answered your question.
Thank you, Toba. Really a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Arshad. Arshad has been one of my buddies and one of my people cheering me on through this process. So it's been like 10 years of working on this. And Michael, who had your own book last year, was very helpful in helping me know what was going to be happening in this process. So I am just so grateful to my family members who just, I really, this book needed to be in the world. I was the vessel. I have very little ego attached to it. I just really want it to be out there. I hope people find it useful and will pass it on. That's really all I want, so that it gets into the hands of those who can use it. So yeah.
Well, I think that's an incredible place to end. Arshad, sorry, I didn't want to cut you off there.
No, I was just going to say the book has, in addition to all the philosophical and spiritual and other explorations, it also has a reference to the 1960s TV show My Favorite Martian, which is important to quite a few of us. Michael made reference to the Flintstones in his book.
Yeah, I tried to include some stories from my life in there as well to move it along. I'm happy to hang around a little bit if folks want to stay on and chat, but I really appreciate everyone zooming in after what may have been a long day of Zoom already. So great to see everybody.
Well, thank you to both of you most sincerely, for Toba for sharing your insight, your incredible writing, your unique perspective. Thank you, Arshad, for leading us through this conversation. I think this has been eye-opening and really beautiful in so many different ways. We appreciate you both so much. Thanks to everybody who is here tonight. We appreciate you as well, being here and being in community with us. We have one more Conversation with Friends event that's on the calendar for the end of this month that is featuring an alumna from the class of 2000, Treva Lindsay, who is a professor and an author. And there are more Conversation with Friends events in the works beginning this summer and next school year. But as always, this event series is really about you all. It's about what you want to hear about, the folks you want to see featured. So if you have a classmate, a alum who's a friend, a parent, a former teacher, or even just a topic that you think would be great for these kinds of conversations, please let us know. We want to hear your ideas and your suggestions. You can email me. You can email alumni@sidwell.edu. We would always love to hear your ideas. The book is God is Here, Reimagining the Divine, and we will put a link to it in the chat. But beyond that, we just appreciate everybody being here. Thank you so much, and we'll see you very soon.
Thank you. And thank you, Anna, for hosting and organizing.